Reluthar, General President-elect for the 81st session of the Indian History Congress, Professor Mridula Mukherjee, one of the most eminent historians of modern India, members of the Executive Committee of the IHC, sectional presidents for the 81st session of the Indian History Congress, members of the general body of the IHC, students and friends. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the online events of the Indian History Congress that will be held today and tomorrow, the 28th and 29th of December 2020. We have seen an unprecedented situation in the country and across the world as a result of the pandemic caused by the COVID-19 virus, which has affected the movement of people and goods, the global economy, and our everyday lives, and resulted in an unprecedented lockdown across the world. Under these circumstances, it was with great regret that the office bearers and the EC of the IHC took the decision to postpone the scheduled annual session, generally held from 28th to 30th December 2020. Our members would know that this is an unprecedented event in the annals of the IHC, as the only times when the sessions were not held were in times of grave national calamity, such as in 1935, between 1935 and 38, in 1942, 1962, and 1971. There have been several occasions when the Congress session was not held as scheduled, but at a later date. The most recent instance being the 79th session, which was to be held in Pune and was cancelled by the local hosts with barely a few weeks to go before the event. This session was then held in February 2019 in Bhopal under the aegis of the Barkatullah University. We earnestly hope that now that a vaccine for the coronavirus has been rolled out in some countries and is set to reach India soon, it is only a matter of time before we can start planning for the 81st session in the new year. Sometime in early November, we received a suggestion from some of our EC members and senior colleagues to hold an online event in the form of a webinar in view of the exceptional circumstances that we find ourselves in. It was further suggested that perhaps we could organize the prestigious Professor S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture as part of this online program. Although instituted only 30, this endowed lecture has become a landmark event at the IHC, generally convened on the evening of the first day of the annual session. We decided to begin our online event with this memorial lecture, and it is my pleasure and privilege to invite you to it. Professor S.C. Mishra, in whose memory the lectures have been instituted by a generous gift from Mrs. Nirmala Mishra, was an eminent historian and served as president of the Indian History Congress in 1981. He was professor and head of the Department of History, Maharaja Sayaji Rao University, Baroda, until his untimely death in 1984. Professor Mishra was a product of the renowned Allahabad School, his PhD thesis on Sher Shah having been submitted to the Allahabad University. Upon his appointment at the MS University, Baroda, he endeavored successfully to establish a strong center of research in medieval history with special attention paid to Gujarat. His book, Rise of Muslim Communities in Gujarat, published in 1964, reflected Mishra's espousal of a critical and sociological approach. This is only the beginning of a 2-decade-long dedicated scholarship on the medieval history of Gujarat. Satish Chandra, R.S. Sharma, A.R. Kulkarni, Irfan Habib, Borun De, Aniruddha Ray, J.V. Nayak, B.N. Mukherjee, Shireen Musvi, Aditya Mukherjee, and N. Ram are among the luminaries who have delivered the Professor S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture in previous years. Today, we have eminent historian Professor Mridula Mukherjee, formerly with the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, who will be delivering the Professor S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture. The topic she has chosen to speak on is Punjab Kisan Protests, a legacy of heroic non-violent resistance. Since Professor Bagchi is not here, and he was to say a few words of welcome and introduce our speakers, let me go ahead and do that on his behalf. We have, as the chair of this session, Professor Keshavan Velutat, the president for the 81st session that would have commenced today if things had gone as planned. Professor Keshavan Velutat is Professor of History, retired from the Department of History, University of Delhi. He has been visiting professor at several places, including at JNU, New Delhi. In 2008, he completed a major research project on the historical atlas of South India. He has been sectional president, Ancient India, of the Indian History Congress. He has authored several books, amongst which Brahmin Settlements in India, in Kerala, Historical Studies, The Political Structure of Early Medieval South India are some of the major ones. I will now briefly introduce Professor Mridula Mukherjee. To most of us, she needs no introduction at all, but to keep with the formalities, it is very necessary to give her the introduction that tells of her work, her stupendous work in the field of modern history. Mridula Mukherjee is Professor of History, retired from the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, as I mentioned earlier, where she taught for over 4 decades. She was director, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library from 2006 to 2011. She's been visiting professor and fellow at La Sapienza, University of Rome, Institute of Advanced Study at Nantes, France, University of Tokyo, and at many other places. She was the sectional president, Modern India, of the Indian History Congress. She has authored Peasants in India's Nonviolent Revolution and Colonializing Agriculture, The Myth of Punjab Exceptionalism. She has co-authored India's Struggle for Independence and India Since Independence, works that are familiar to every student of history across the country. She is also co-editor of the Sage series in Modern Indian History. I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Mridula Mukherjee, and I invite Professor Keshavan Velutat to chair this session and to take over the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahalakshmi. Esteemed colleagues and dear friends, let me first of all place on record my sense of appreciation for the resourcefulness that the management of Indian History Congress has shown in dealing with the crisis that we are going through. They have come forward to organize these online events when an actual physical session of the Congress proved to be impossible on the appointed dates. By doing this, they have told the world that we will not accept a defeat just lying down, even when an unprecedented outbreak of pandemic is holding the whole world to ransom. I take this opportunity also to thank Professor Mahalakshmi Ramakrishnan, the Secretary of Indian History Congress, for the singular honor she has done me by asking me to sit in this chair this morning. The Professor S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture, as all of you know, is one of the 3 most prestigious events that happen in the plenary sessions of the Indian History Congress, the other 2 being the inaugural session and the AHC Symposium. That is invariably the General President who presides over these, and in his absence, one of the Vice Presidents. Here the paradox is both are present here. My dear friend, Professor Mahalakshmi has chosen to violate this convention and confer this honor on a mere nobody in the Indian History Congress. True, the Congress has elected me General President, but one cannot assume that position until one is formally installed as General President. Weakness for a friend and nothing else, I fear, seems to have prompted Professor Mahalakshmi to go out of her way in this manner. In any case, I thank her and the management of the Indian History Congress for this gesture. My feeling of honor is all the stronger because Professor Mridula Mukherjee, who is giving this lecture this morning, is my own teacher. She has, as always, chosen a most appropriate theme for her lecture, Punjab Kisan Protests, a legacy of heroic, non-violent resistance. In the present context, when protests of peasants from Punjab are showing what real resistance is, when that is threatening a regime that seeks to offer our economy in a platter to the corporates, there cannot be a better theme on which a concerned historian can speak. Those in the corridors of power who have had little experience of and less knowledge about India's struggle for freedom will do well to take a lesson or two from such episodes in the past of which Professor Mukherjee is going to speak. We in the Indian History Congress have always raised our voice against blatant violations of democratic values, and I must, even at the expense of being less than modest, congratulate my teacher for choosing this most appropriate theme for her lecture. With these words, I request Professor Mukherjee to deliver the lecture. Professor Mukherjee.
Thank you very much, Keshavan. I'm very grateful to the Indian History Congress for giving me this honor in this very unusual session. Those of us old-timers at the Indian History Congress know how we would all flock in the evening to hear the S.C. Mishra Memorial Lecture, and now to be delivering this in this very different format is, of course, a bit strange, but I think it's still something very good that we are managing to do this, and we are managing to reach so many people in these tough times. I'm sure it will bring some cheer and some sense of purpose to our otherwise slightly lonely and isolated lives. It gives us at least a chance to see each other, see your faces on the screens, hear your voices, and that itself, I think, gives a sense of comradeship, which I value very much, which is, I think, what the Indian History Congress is all about. That's why we go there every year to, be part of something bigger, be part of something important, to meet friends, to meet comrades in arms with whom we've been fighting many battles over the years. So I'm really very grateful for this opportunity, which the Indian History Congress, and particularly to the General Secretary, Mahalakshmi, who invited me for this. I'm very grateful to Keshavan for chairing this. I hope we will be able to see Professor Bagchi join us at some point in this lecture. So let me then get ahead with the subject of my, the purpose of my being here today. I'm just going to take half a second to just get my lecture onto the screen. Yeah. So as you know, the topic of my talk is Punjab Kisan Protests, Legacy of Heroic Nonviolent Struggle. As I speak, the Kisans of Punjab, as well as other parts of India, are engaged in what they see as a life and death struggle with the government of India. For them, it is a struggle not only for MSP or for mandis, but to save their very identity as Kisans. What they anticipate and fear is the loss of a whole way of life, of their world, which is intricately linked up with their land and the labor they and
recorded message.
have put into it. Is there any problem? No. The rosy prospect offered to them by government of becoming contract farmers of big private companies on their own land, taking orders about what to grow, how to grow, which fertilizers and which insecticides to use, selling to them at dictated prices does not allure them. What they see in the future is the tentacles of these private players closing in on them and reducing them to tenants and workers on their own land. And for them, that is worse than death, which is why they are willing to fight on despite heavy odds, which is why the women and the youth and the children are out there in the cold. They see their future dissolving into an abyss. Observers are frequently surprised by the calm determination and firm resolve of the protesters. Where does it emanate from? They are also surprised by the sophistication of the Kisan unions and their clarity of purpose and capacity to organize. They might be less surprised if they knew something about the history of Kisan protest in the Punjab. The fault is not theirs alone, as the Punjab story has been mostly ignored or underplayed in the recounting of Kisan protest in colonial India. The focus has been on Gujarat, Bardoli and Kheda, on Bihar, Champaran and Swami Sahajanand, Bengal, Tibhaga movement, Andhra, NG Ranga, and then the Telangana armed struggle. To some extent, Kerala, the Karshaka Sangha movement. Punjab, even though it had a strong tradition of peasant protest, along with the UP and Maharashtra and Assam, has received much less attention. Many years ago, I tried to set the record straight for Punjab by researching and writing the history of peasant protest in the first half of the 20th century. Not many were interested in my effort. By then, peasants were out of fashion with historians and other social scientists, possibly because they were not subaltern enough, and with policymakers, perhaps because they were not an immediate threat or concern, as agrarian unrest of all kinds had been on the decline since the 1970s and 80s. But since last month, when Punjab Kisans with their colorful turbans and noisy tractors and trolleys and plentiful langars have parked themselves on the borders of the national capital, waiting to be let in, my fortunes have revived. And even the Indian History Congress, the august body of Indian historians, happily accepted my proposal for the topic of the S.C. Mishra lecture. I doubt that I would have got away with talking about this outmoded subject last year. But that is how contemporary history is. The present can jolt us into looking at our past in ways that we cannot predict. So I begin by acknowledging my debt to the Kisans of Punjab who have revived this interest in my old-fashioned style of history. As I began to prepare this talk, I was myself surprised by the extraordinary way in which this current protest resonates with the past that I'm going to talk about. I will demonstrate to you how the great-grandparents and grandparents and even parents of some of the older participants fought against government legislation that they did not like, how they were supported by their family members who had gone abroad to labor. Then the British government even did not call it foreign funding. How those who had gone abroad were imbued with a strong sense of identity with their motherland. How they set examples of non-violent heroism in the Akali movement, which were acknowledged by Gandhiji himself and only matched by the Dharasana Satyagrahis. How Kisan unions were organized from the village upwards. How sharecroppers revolted against private companies who leased the land from the government, and so on. How women were part of the struggle, including at the leadership level. How intellectually sophisticated the movement was, what kind of intellectual support it had. A mature leadership, willing to make tremendous sacrifices. How newspapers, Even mainstream ones such as the Tribune played a great role in the building up of this protest. In this lecture, I will attempt to show how beginning in 1907 with the Swadeshi movement, or the Pagdi Sambhalo Jatta movement, as it was popularly called in the Punjab, the tradition of peasant or Kisan protest was strengthened by the Gadar movement of 1914, by the Akali movement from 1920 to 20, by the activities of the Kisan Party and Naujawan Bharat Sabha founded by Bhagat Singh in the late 20s, the major national struggles such as the civil disobedience movement of 1930 to 32, the Kisan Sabha movement of peasants against high land revenue and water rates and against indebtedness during the years 31 to 36, of sharecroppers against exorbitant rent demands of private companies and landlords in 1938-39 in the Nilibar and Montgomery Canal colonies, of the peasants of Amritsar and Lahore in the Uche Pulda Morcha and Lahore Kisan Morcha against attempts to enhance revenue in new settlements in 38 and 39, the Muzara or tenants movement in Patiala from 37 to 53, the anti-war and the individual civil disobedience movement from 39 to 41, the Quit India movement in 1942, the Harsha China Morcha and the pro-INA soldiers movement in the post-war years. Just this list which I have read out to you should begin to convince you of the strength of this tradition. I also demonstrate that we have to take into account the role not only of the Indian National Congress and the Akalis, but also of left-wing groups and parties such as the Kirtis, Communists, Bhagat Singh and Naujawan Bharat Sabha, of the Congress Socialists, and of individuals who were of left-wing inclinations such as Professor Brij Narayan, BPL Bedi, Munshi Ahmed Deen, etc. There would of course be regional variations in this picture, with the greatest strength of the movement being visible in the central districts, most of which constitute present-day Indian Punjab, followed by the southeastern Punjab, which is Haryana today. Much of western Punjab, which went to Pakistan, home to a very backward, rack-rented tenant population dominated by big feudal landlords, remained outside the influence of modern politics itself. I begin with the Swadeshi movement of 1905 to 1907. The origins of the tradition of what I have called heroic non-violent resistance in Punjab can be traced back to the Pagdi Sambhalo Jatta movement of 1907, which the British referred to as the Punjab disturbances, which were part of the Swadeshi movement. The Swadeshi movement, as you all know, began as a protest against the partition of Bengal in 1905, but soon spread to other parts of the country. It was particularly strong in Bombay and Punjab. In Punjab, the movement went beyond urban confines and linked up with a strong rural protest that was building up due to certain unpopular government measures. The most important of these was the Punjab Land Colonization Bill, introduced in the Punjab Council on 25th October 1906, which sought to drastically change the conditions on which land was granted to colonists in the canal colonies of the Punjab. In addition, the government also ordered a sharp enhancement in the canal water rates on the Badi Doab Canal, which irrigated the districts of Amritsar, Gurdaspur, and Lahore. The average increase itself was 25%, but on special crops as high as 50%. Simultaneously, there was a sharp increase in the land revenue of Rawalpindi district as a result of a new settlement. Very interesting, again, 3 government measures, just as we now have these 3 bills, were then at the heart of the trouble. The initial lead was taken by some landowners belonging to the Bar Zamindar Association, many of them who were local lawyers, and by the Zamindar newspaper edited by Sirajuddin, which called for organizing mass meetings at which resolutions condemning the bill and advocating refusal to pay the fines were passed. The numbers attending these meetings grew rapidly, and a meeting held at Lalpur on 3rd February 1907 was attended by 10,000 people. Agitation intensified further in March, and a new element was added by the participation of nationalist leaders and activists from Lahore, such as Lala Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh, the uncle of Bhagat Singh, who contributed to the movement by sharpening its political focus and by popularizing its demands outside the colony areas, and thus garnering much needed support from the urban and rural population of the province as a whole. From April onwards, especially through the efforts of Ajit Singh, the peasants of Amritsar and Lahore also began to voice their protests against the enhanced water rates on the Badi Doab Canal through mass meetings and resolves to refuse to pay the new rates. The movement is also, meetings were marked by their sharp anti-government tone, by their appeals for maintenance of communal unity, and by appeal to the peasants to stand up for their rights, to protect their self-respect. The movement is also therefore popularly known by the opening line of the poem that became its symbol and was first recited at a mass gathering in March 1907 in Layarpur. Pagdi Sambhalo Jatta. O peasant, protect your self-respect. The pagdi is a sign of your self-respect. A marked feature of the meetings was the participation of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, and the complete absence of any communal divide. By the beginning of May, the government of Punjab, probably a little smarter than the ones we have around now, was in a panic. A riot in Rawalpindi town on the occasion of the arrest of 3 leaders who had organized a public meeting to protest against the increase in water rates and in land revenue and municipal taxes in Rawalpindi strengthened the government's growing conviction that the whole movement was being organized by urban nationalist agitators as part of a conspiracy to overthrow the government. Read Urban Naxals. Reports of the disaffection spreading among soldiers and ex-soldiers further contributed to the alarmist atmosphere, and repression began in earnest. Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh, who were considered the chief conspirators, were deported in May and June to Burma. Meetings were banned in 5 districts, the press was gagged, and incitement to non-payment of government dues made a penal offense. But simultaneously, however, independent inquiries directed by Lord Kitchener, the then Commander-in-Chief, and conducted by army officers in the affected districts convinced the Government of India that the unrest could not be contained without a retreat on the colonization bill and the water rates enhancement, and that its repercussions on the loyalty of the soldiers could be serious. Therefore, what did the government do? The colonization bill was then vetoed by the Viceroy. It had yet to go to the Viceroy for approval. And the Punjab government withdrew the enhancement of the water rates. In November, Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh were released. An official inquiry established that the agitation against the enhancement of water rates was largely justified, and the colonization bill that was finally enacted in 1912 was free of almost all the objections raised to its precursor of 1906. I have presented with you a template of possible action by the government today. The agitation of 1907 demonstrated that the proverbial loyalty of the Punjabi peasants, a loyalty that was essential if the peasant communities were to continue to be designated as martial races, from which a major component of the British Indian Army was recruited, could no longer be taken for granted. It was Ajit Singh, the uncle of Bhagat Singh, the man who was the most active in trying to integrate the various sectors of the 1907 agitation and to give it a sharp political edge, who became the hero and the symbol of 1907. This link that was forged between the assertive nationalism found in the towns and the peasants' struggle for their rights in 1907 continued to inspire later generations of political activists, who in turn ensured that the experience of 1907 remained alive in popular memory as a symbol of heroic, non-violent peasant protest and secular nationalism. We next come to the Gadar movement. This most important movement that was to have a far-reaching impact on the peasants of Punjab, even though it was not a peasant movement. This movement was started the years in which it was strongest was in 1914-15. It originated among Indian immigrants on the west coast of North America, the vast majority of whom were from the small-holding Sikh peasant families of central Punjab, but also included Indian students and political exiles living in the USA. The same is the picture today. Most of those who labor abroad from the Punjab are from the small-holding Sikh peasant families of central Punjab. It got its name from a weekly paper, The Gadar, that was brought out from November 1913 by a group of political activists led by Lala Hardayal, a Hindu, an Indian revolutionary who was in political exile. The paper obviously answered a very deeply felt need among the immigrant Indian communities and was avidly read not only in North America, but also in the Philippines, in the Malay states, in China, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Burma, in Trinidad, in the Honduras. At some places, people gathered together regularly to read, discuss, and debate the issues raised by the paper and recite the poems it carried. On the front page of each issue was a feature titled Angrezi Raj Ka Kacha Chitta, or an expose of British rule. And this consisted of 14 points enumerating the harmful effects of British rule, including the drain of wealth, the low per capita income of Indians, the high land tax, etc., etc. In sum, the entire critique of British rule that had been formulated by the Indian national movement was summarized and presented every week to the Gadar readers. The last 2 points of the Chitta suggested the solution. The Indian population numbers 7 crores in the Indian states and 24 crores in British India, while there are only 79,614 officers and soldiers and 38,948 volunteers who are Englishmen. Number 2, 56 years have lapsed since the revolt of 1857. Now there is an urgent need for a second one. But perhaps the most powerful impact was made by the poems that appeared in the Gadar, soon collected and published as Gadar Di Gunj and distributed free of cost. These poems were marked as much by their secular tone as by their revolutionary zeal. The Gadar succeeded in a very brief time in changing the self-image of the Punjabi immigrant from that of a loyal soldier of the British Raj to that of a rebel whose only aim was to destroy the British hold on his motherland. It consciously made the Punjabi aware of his loyalist past, made him feel ashamed of it, and challenged him to atone for it in the name of his earlier tradition of resistance to oppression. While the Gadar was busy spreading the message of revolts, the events surrounding the fateful voyage of the ship Komagata Maru further inflamed immigrant passions. The outbreak of the First World War had also placed the Gadar leaders in a dilemma. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for, since it was obvious that the best time for a revolt in India was when the British had their hands full with the war. But they were not yet quite ready. Their organization in India was almost non-existent and they had no arms. Despite these limitations, however, the Gadar leadership gave the call for a war on the British. Indians abroad were asked to return home. And the remarkable fact was that 8,000 Indians actually heeded the call and returned home. And the vast majority of these were Punjabi Sikhs. However, tragically, the government of India was much better prepared and systematically intercepted the returning immigrants, separated the dangerous ones, interned them, restricted their movements, and the few who were able to escape tried to go around the Punjab and build up discontent over there, even tried in the cantonments, they tried the soldiers. But the situation in Punjab actually was not conducive to the building up of a revolt, which is a different story. But the government then came in with a very heavy hand. And this is where the whole point of tradition of resistance comes in. The British succeeded in penetrating the organization, and most of the leaders were arrested and severe repression launched. 45 of the Gadar revolutionaries were hanged, and 200 others were sent to what was Kalapani, or long years of imprisonment, mostly in the Andamans. Should we therefore conclude that the Gadarites fought in vain? Because they could not drive out the British, their movement was a failure. These conclusions are not necessarily correct, because the success or failure of a political movement is not always to be measured in terms of its achievement of stated objectives. By that measure, all the major national struggles, whether of 1920, 22, 30, 34, or 42, would have to be classified as failures, since none of them culminated in Indian independence. But if the success and failure are to be measured in terms of the deepening of nationalist consciousness, the evolution and testing of new strategies and methods of struggle, the creation of traditions of resistance, of secularism, of democracy, of egalitarianism, then the Ghadarites certainly contributed more than their share to the struggle for freedom. Ironic though it may seem, it was in the realm of ideology that the Ghadar success was the greatest. The entire nationalist critique of colonialism, which was the most solid and abiding contribution of the moderate nationalists, was carried in a powerful and simple form to the mass of Indian immigrants, most of whom were poor workers and agricultural laborers. This propaganda effort motivated and educated an entire generation. Though a majority of the leaders of the Ghadar movement and most of the participants were drawn from among the Sikhs, the ideology that was created and spread through the Ghadar and Ghadar Di Gunj was strongly secular in tone. This too is very important for the future course of the peasant movement in Punjab. Concern with religion was seen as petty and narrow-minded and unworthy of revolutionaries. That this was not mere brave talk is seen by the ease with which leaders belonging to different religions and regions were accepted by the movement. Lala Hardyal was a Hindu, so was Ramchandra, other major leader, and many others. For example, Barkatullah was a Muslim, Rash Behari Bose, a Hindu and a Bengali. Further, the nationalist salute Bande Mataram and not any Sikh religious greeting was urged upon and adopted as the rallying cry of the Ghadar movement. They sought to give a new meaning to religion as well. They urged that religion lay not in observing the outward forms, such as those signified by long hair and kirpan, but in remaining true to the model of good behavior that was enjoined by all religious teachings. Far from dwelling on the greatness of Sikhs or the Punjabis, the Ghadars constantly criticized the loyalist role played by the Punjabis during 1857, as I have already mentioned. In the words of Sohan Singh Bhakna, who later became a major peasant and communist leader, I quote him, he said, "We were not Sikhs or Punjabis. Our religion was patriotism." Another marked feature of Ghadar ideology, which was also very important for the later developments, was its democratic and egalitarian content. Deeply influenced as he was by anarchist and syndicalist movements and even by socialist ideas, Hardyal imparted to the movement an egalitarian ideology. Perhaps this is what facilitated the transformation of many Ghadarites into peasant leaders and communists in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the communist and peasant movement in Punjab was really built by the Ghadarites. Hardyal's other major contribution was the creation of a truly internationalist outlook among the Ghadar revolutionaries. His lectures and articles were full of references to Irish, Mexican, and Russian revolutionaries. He referred to the Mexican revolutionaries as Mexican Ghadarites. Therefore, the Ghadar activists were distinguished by their secular, egalitarian, democratic, and non-chauvinistic internationalist outlook. And as I just said, in the late 1920s and 30s, the surviving Ghadarites helped lay the foundations of a secular, nationalist, and peasant movement in India. We now turn very briefly to the Akali movement, which was there from 1920 to 1925. This movement, the Akali movement, or the movement for reform of the Sikh shrines or gurdwaras, was of profound significance as it was the harbinger of a democratic, anti-feudal and anti-imperialist consciousness among the vast mass of the Sikh peasantry of central Punjab. Its central aim that Gurdwaras must be managed by popularly elected representatives of the Sikhs and not by the corrupt feudal-style mahants or priests, or by the government or its representatives, though obviously religious in form, had a clear democratic and anti-feudal message. And as the struggle developed and the British lined up behind the loyalist priests, the anti-imperialist focus of the movement also grew sharper. The growing anger against the Mahants among the Sikh nationalists and reformers came to a boiling point first when the priests of the Golden Temple at Amritsar declared the Ghadar revolutionaries as fallen Sikhs or renegades, and then when they specially honored the notorious General Dyer, who was responsible for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 and even declared him an honorary Sikh. The movement began in 1920 with the organization of jathas or groups of volunteers whose task was to liberate the Gurdwaras from the control of the Mahants and government-appointed managers. If I may just stop for a moment and say this is the beginning of the jathas, a form of organization and then of struggle, which then became very common in the Indian freedom struggle. The government had not yet decided on a clear policy, nor was it aware of the potential strength of the movement. Consequently, not willing to alienate the reformers at this stage, it allowed the control of many Gurdwaras to fall into the hands of reformers. Encouraged by this easy success, the movement surged forward. The Mahant of the Gurdwara at Nankana, which is Guru Nanak's birthplace, however, had different ideas. When a Jatha of Akali volunteers entered the Gurdwara on 21st February 1921 to pray, he ordered his band of 500 armed mercenaries to open fire and attack the Jatha. Nearly 100 Akalis were killed in the process, and the incident immediately attracted nationwide attention. The Akalis succeeded in wresting control of the Gurdwara by continuing to send Jathas, but the experience had transformed the perceptions of the nature of the struggle. After this, the Akali movement moved closer to the ongoing non-cooperation movement and not only adopted many of its programs, such as boycott of British goods and liquor and setting up of panchayats, but also accepted its total emphasis on non-violence. And it is in this next incident that this display of non-violence in a pristine form comes to the fore. In August 1922, this is the famous Guru Ka Bagh Morcha. A confrontation developed between the Akalis and the Mahant of Guru Ka Bagh Gurdwara near Amritsar over control of lands attached to the Gurdwara. The Akalis, who had already gained control of the Gurdwara, cut some firewood from the disputed land. The Mahant reported a theft to the police, who promptly came and arrested the Akalis and put them on trial. At this, Jathas began to arrive and cut trees from the disputed land. The government arrested 4,000 Akalis. Then suddenly changed track and decided to order beating up of the Jathas with lathis. In subsequent days, Guru Ka Bagh Morcha was witness to the most harrowing scenes of police brutality and the most heroic examples of non-violent resistance. Countrywide condemnation followed, and the government was again forced to retreat. Another big struggle took place at Jaito in Nabha, in which even Jawaharlal Nehru was paraded with handcuffs in the streets and then spent a few weeks in Nabha jail in the most unsanitary conditions. The Akali movement culminated in the passing of the Gurdwara Reform Act in 1925, which gave control over the Gurdwaras to an elected body. Thus, the Akali movement had succeeded in mobilizing a broad front of all sections of Sikhs, urban as well as in gaining the sympathy and at times even participation of other religious groups such as Hindus and Muslims. Nevertheless, it is beyond doubt that its main base was among the Sikh peasantry of Punjab, including the princely states. The scale of this mobilization was remarkable indeed. All told, about 30,000 went to jail. And of these, the vast majority were peasants, which is why this is so important for our story. An estimate made of the strength of the Akali Jathas in early 1922 placed the total number, excluding the princely states and southwest and southeast Punjab, at 15,506, of whom 10,200 were Jats, and another 2,399 were from the non-landowning, artisan and laboring castes. Besides these activists, there were obviously thousands who participated by feeding the jathas, making other contributions, attending meetings, and the like. The main strength of the movement was again in the central districts, Lahore, Amritsar, Sheikhupura, Gurdaspur, Jalandhar, and Lalpur, but also in the princely states of Kapurthala, Patiala, and Nabha. The significance of the politicization achieved by the Akali movement becomes immediately apparent when we find that it is this area that was to remain the main base of the subsequent national and peasant struggles as well. The struggles for the reform of the Gurdwaras thus performed for the Sikh peasantry the task that was performed for most other regions of the country by the non-cooperation movement. That is, the task of awakening them to modern democratic and nationalist consciousness and organization. If you will do an analysis of those who are participating in the movement today, you will again find that they are coming from the same regions. I now come to another aspect, which gives a different turn to peasant protest in Punjab, which is the emergence of left-wing groups and parties. This tradition of protest in Punjab received a big boost with the emergence of left-wing groups and parties which were ideologically strongly anti-imperialist and staunchly secular, as well as being socialist. As elsewhere in the country, the 1920s were witness to the emergence of new left-wing ideological currents in Punjab, largely under the influence of the Russian Revolution, which fired the imagination of many young nationalists by opening up new vistas of human liberation. On 12th April 1928, the Kirti Kisan Party was founded in Amritsar. And this emergence of the Kirti Kisan Party also coincided with the revival of the Naujawan Bharat Sabha, originally founded in Lahore in 1926 by a group of radical youth led by Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Bhagwati Charan Vora, and Ram Kishan, influenced by the revolutionary movement led by the Hindustan Republican Association as a forum for the mass organization of youth. This impact of this trend was to be seen very soon in the forthcoming anti-Simon Commission protest. After the lull following the end of the non-cooperation and Akali movements, nationalist political activity re-emerged with the announcement of the all-white Simon Commission in November 1927. It led to new efforts at unity, and though these were quite successful, the time for organization was short, and the countrywide boycott announced for 3rd February 1928, the day Simon set foot on Indian soil, met with a relatively lukewarm response in the province. But later in the year, when the Simon Commission reached Lahore, a very successful demonstration was organized on 30th October with Lala Lajpat Rai at its head. A vicious lathi charge by the police on the demonstration led to injuries to many of the senior leaders, and Lala Lajpat Rai succumbed to these on the 17th of November. This led to a mass outrage, and his death was avenged by Bhagat Singh and his comrades of the Naujawan Bharat Sabha, a youth organization, whose members had earlier denounced Lajpat Rai in the strongest terms for his communal outlook. They shot dead on December 17th the white police official they suspected had been responsible for Lajpat Rai's death. A new atmosphere, reflective of a new wave of struggle, had been born, and throughout 1929, nationalist feeling was on the upswing. The significance of this event, of Bhagat Singh's involvement in this act, his subsequent arrest, his subsequent trial, and subsequent hanging, and the impact of that, of course, on the politics of Punjab, but even on the politics of India, we all know was very significant. Therefore, I've particularly made a mention of this here today so that I can link it up later with the broader movement that is going on. The Lahore session of the Indian National Congress took place in the last week of the year 1929, and it declared complete independence as the aim of the Congress and also resolved upon a movement of civil disobedience to be launched shortly. The tone of the new stage was reflected in Jawaharlal Nehru's declaration in his presidential address to the Lahore Congress. I must frankly confess that I am a socialist and a republican and am no believer in kings and princes, or in the order which produces the modern kings of industry, who have greater power over the lives and fortunes of men than even the kings of old, and whose methods are as predatory as those of the old feudal aristocracy. This, as I said, set the tone for what was to follow. A militancy, an egalitarian outlook, emphasis on the struggles of workers and peasants, all this is what then comes to the fore in the following years. The decision at Lahore that a mass campaign of civil disobedience would soon be inaugurated immediately resulted in a flurry of activity all over the province, and the rural areas were soon alive with a whole variety of agitations and mobilization. The Naujawan Bharat Sabha and the Kirti Kisan Party, who I have just mentioned, were very active in this, of course, along with the Congress. The other common feature which strikes one sharply again at this time is the secular tone of all the propaganda and the absence of any appeals to religious sentiment. This was as true of leftists as it was of the non-leftists. In fact, the necessity of communal amity and of special efforts to get Muslims to participate in the movement was invariably stressed. I would now briefly like to talk about a campaign of non-payment of land revenue, which was started at this time, and because this had a very powerful impact on the peasantry of the province and radicalized them to a very great extent. On 15th May 1930, the Congress Working Committee gave permission to the PCCs to begin the campaign of non-payment of land revenue wherever they thought fit. This immediately led in Punjab to an intensification of activity connected with encouraging the non-payment of land revenue. By the end of May, the situation on this front was serious enough for the Punjab government to ask for the extension of the ordinance, which granted powers to arrest and prosecute those who incited others not to pay taxes. And then these powers were freely used to arrest those involved in promoting the campaign. In all, 800 persons were prosecuted under this ordinance alone, of which 737 were actually convicted. And mind you, these arrests were only of those who were instigating, not of those who were not paying the tax. So the number of activists who were picked up within a very short period of time, between the middle of May and middle of July, was 800. In fact, it seemed that the chances of this movement taking off were so high that the government was actually very frightened. But that is why it took such firm action and such repressive action, and actually then it succeeded in nipping the movement before it actually reached the stage of mass refusal to pay taxes. However, the civil disobedience movement, the no tax campaign, produced a generalized anti-British sentiment among the Kisans, which also spilled over in the form of an anti-loyalist sentiment. And here, to give you an idea of the atmosphere of the times in the rural areas among the Kisans, I will quote to you from a report of an army officer who conducted a special tour in the rural areas of the districts of Jhang, Lalpur, Shekhupura, Gujranwala, Gurdaspur and Lahore between early May and mid-June 1930, peak period of the civil disobedience movement. I quote, he says, "A salam is becoming comparatively rare along the main roads. Small collections of people in bus stops, at railway stations and in the outskirts of villages, on seeing isolated military officers, at once chorus, Inqilab Zindabad. Both old and young. The fate of the old soldier and other loyalists in many villages is deplorable and elicits my deep sympathy. They cannot worship except in khadar clothing. Their fields are garnered with difficulty. Their laborers are cleared off by Congress agents. Their family cannot leave their houses without molestation, even for purposes of nature. They are not allowed to draw water at the village wells, nor will the Congress agents allow the village banyas to supply them. They are insulted at every turn and generally life is a burden. Why they remain loyal is a mystery to me. In addition, water does not reach their fields. In some of the villages, loyal men go armed with escorts and are in daily fear of limb or even life. This applies also to loyal Lambardars whose loyalty is strained most unfairly. What a description of a province which was supposed to be the home of the martial races. Such was the impact of these movements. Another illustration of the new spirit abroad was the refusal of villagers to continue to perform bigar. Bigar was giving free supplies to officials who were on tour or came to actually repress you or to arrest you. You were still supposed to give them free supplies. A refusal which led to serious clashes in a number of cases. One such heroic village was Jhaman in the district of Lahore. It was a village with a mixed Hindu, Muslim and Sikh population in which the Congress had been active for the last 8 or 9 years. Since April 30, activities were intensified once it became known that the government was going to appoint a punitive police post to keep a watch on the village. A punitive police post was a police post put in your village for which the whole village had to pay. The special police that was dispatched to the village faced a total social boycott. The situation came to a head on 18 June when an additional police force was also refused eatables by the shopkeepers. The police brutally beat up the villagers, including the women, who remained non-violent. More than 100 were injured. The next day, troops with machine guns were sent to the village and aeroplanes hovered overhead. The village was completely blockaded and 50 arrests were made. Neighbors wanting to show solidarity were refused permission to go. Goods were forcibly seized from shopkeepers, houses taken over for stationing the police, and arrested people tortured by tying them to charpoys and making them stand in the hot June sun. Despite all this repression, a month later, the villagers were still refusing to let the policemen grind their grain at the flour mill, staying par of the peasants, which we are witnessing now at the borders of Delhi. A village in Amritsar district, Tharu, presented another interesting example of resistance. The story began when jathas of Congress volunteers on 10th June started from Taran Taran, a nearby town, for carrying on propaganda in the villages. They reached Tharu after holding a meeting at village Mirdi en route. All of them were arrested. After this, the Congress War Council continued daily to send jathas of volunteers, and every day they would be arrested on reaching the village. However, since the arrests seemed to have no effect in dampening the flow of volunteers or in curbing popular enthusiasm, for example, an eyewitness relates how little boys would run after the jathas, which consisted of Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims, shouting Inqilab Zindabad and Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. So the government now changed its policy, started arresting the volunteers before they reached the village, and then blockaded the village and unleashed terror. Witnesses maintained that shops were broken open, sick men, women and children were beaten up brutally, all because they had looked after the Satyagrahi jathas and refused to supply the police on credit and demanded cash, and all this despite having paid up the land revenue. Jhaman and Tharu were not exceptions. In certain districts like Hisar and Rohtak, extensive arrests and prosecutions had been launched in April itself. And in others such as Amritsar, public servants suspected of disloyalty were dismissed to serve as examples to others. Large-scale repression was launched in early June, and 2,381 arrests had already been effected between the 1st of June and 6th of July. That is in just over a month. And sentences ranging from 1 to 2 years of rigorous imprisonment were freely given. And in early June, the Congress organizations that were active in directing the struggle were declared as unlawful associations. However, a new change came in this atmosphere once the Gandhi-Irwin talks started. Once the national leaders were released in January and the negotiations began, loyalists were disheartened and nationalists became jubilant. And these feelings increased once the pact was signed. Military officers touring the rural areas in February had already noted reports of impending rapprochement between the government and the Congress were worrying the soldiers and other loyalist elements. Once the pact came into force, Loyalists and officials became worried and nationalists became exultant. The feeling of victory was expressed in the rousing welcomes given to released prisoners. Reports of jathas of volunteers visiting villages to form Congress committees began to appear, and very soon rural conferences began to be organized in which peasants were congratulated for their participation in the movement. In some districts of southeastern Punjab, such as Rohtak, Hisar and Karnal, again very interesting, these are areas from which many of your peasants are coming from now, an attempt was made from mid-April to set up a parallel government of sorts, with Congress thanedars appointed for each thana, and they were to hold public meetings in each large village every Sunday. Thus, the civil disobedience movement, with its emphasis on the defiance of laws and the authority of the state, had undoubtedly furthered and strengthened the process of the building up of self-confidence, dignity, and capacity to resist oppression that had been initiated and advanced among the peasants by earlier mass anti-imperialist movements. That poor villagers could refuse to give free supplies to the police and refuse to perform begar and prefer to get beaten up rather than submit was unthinkable and unheard of a few years earlier. The cool determination with which the Congress volunteers offered arrest and accepted beatings, the careless abandon with which the youth of the NGBS, the Naujawan Bharat Sabha, challenged the state and even laid down their lives, the tireless consistency with which the Gadarite Kirtis, who had abandoned the charms of the West for the sake of their motherland, propagated the message of Mazdoor Kisan Raj, despite continuous interruptions by detentions, internments, and confiscation, could not but help to straighten the backs that had been kept bent for long with hard toil, servility, and fear. I now come to the next stage of the peasant movement, in which it becomes much more of a pure peasant movement, more like a trade union movement, rather than just as part of other broader struggles like the Pagdi Sambhalo Jatta movement, or the Akali movement, or the Gadar movement, or the civil disobedience movement. And clear-cut peasant organizations begin to emerge. This is the period from 1933 to 1937. I'll briefly talk about it because my time is running very short. Once civil disobedience movement was over and the impact of the Great Depression was being acutely felt by the agrarian classes of Punjab due to the crash in agricultural prices, which made the payment of government dues very difficult, a spate of protests arose on the issue. Demands for remission of land revenue and water rates were voiced by all political trends, and meetings and petitions abounded. However, over time, it was the more left-wing elements who came to the fore and sustained the agitation. This was serious enough to worry the government, which noted that, I quote, rural agitation on communist lines, unquote, was beginning to establish itself in central Punjab by the middle of 1934. It seemed that a united provincial level organization under left control might emerge in the near future. To nip this possibility in the bud, as well as in accordance with the broader policy of the Government of India, the Punjab government issued a notification on 10th September 1934 declaring unlawful the following 5 associations, which were all left-wing associations: the Anti-Imperialist League, the Punjab Provincial Naujawan Bharat Sabha, the Punjab Kirti Kisan Party, the Amritsar District Kisan Sabha, and the Punjab Kisan League. Of these, 2 were purely peasant organizations. So you can, from this, make out how dangerous these were being seen. However, the movement demanding remissions in taxation continued. The one common demand in all districts, irrespective of the political affiliation of the groups, was for reduction in the government's appropriation of surplus via land revenue and water rates. Almost everyone wanted at least a 50% reduction immediately, as the effects of the depression had far from worn off. In Amritsar, in addition, there was an attempt to ensure that future settlements of land revenue would be lenient and assessment made on the same basis as income tax. Further, the demand for abolition of all kinds of extra cesses, which were collected in addition to the land revenue, such as Malba, which was a village common fund, Chokidara, to sustain the Chokidar, Panchotra and Chahi raids were also gathering force. In addition, at gatherings organized by the left-wing groups, demands for the release of political prisoners undergoing imprisonment in the Gadar conspiracy case of 1914-15, as well as of those detained without trial as state prisoners for a long time, were voiced. Please remember what a big furore was made by our government of one organization at the Tikri border holding up posters of some of the people that the government has sought to keep in prison and asking for their release on Human Rights Day. You can see glimmers of it here. So political demands have always been part of the peasant movement. Political demands are not something outside the ambit of a peasant movement. Another movement directly caused by the depression that emerged in this period was around the issue of debt or karza. The form it took was of the setting up of karza committees in villages. The pattern of activity was to go into the villages and to explain to the people that they could never get free of the burden of debt unless it was cancelled. Karam Singh Maan, the major communist leader of this phase, had written a pamphlet in which he had graphically described the burden by saying that if they had a line of camels and loaded each camel with 1 mond of rupees, the line of camels would extend to Calcutta. Such was the burden of debt. This pamphlet became very popular because it explained very graphically what the whole thing was about. After explaining the problem, peasants would be asked to join the Karza committees with a membership fee of 1 anna, and the village Karza committee would be formed. Obviously, the political message was also carried through these meetings, which, in the words of a government report, combined, I quote, agrarian agitation with communist propaganda. There is little doubt that this movement to set up the Karza committees touched a sympathetic chord in the peasant heart. The Punjab Kisan Karza Committee, a provincial level organization, was therefore set up on March 1935 in Amritsar with 52 members. Nor is it surprising that the main success of the movement was in the Jalandhar area, which was much more heavily indebted because of the small size of its holdings than, say, Amritsar. The movement clearly had an impact in making the Unionist Party later take up the issue and pass ameliorative debt legislation. I've mentioned this here because even today, indebtedness is a big issue with Kisans, and writing off of debts always becomes a big issue at election time and as well as when Kisan demands are put forward. The culmination of this process, which I just talked about, was finally on 7th March 1937, the setting up of the provincial branch of the All India Kisan Sabha. The All India Kisan Sabha had been set up in 1936 at the Lucknow session. Along with the Indian National Congress, there was the first session of the All India Kisan Sabha, and the members over there were asked to set up branches of this in all their provinces. And this was a big step forward because for the first time, a provincial level organization in an organized, in a systematic and organized way would now undertake the task of building up the Kisan movement or the peasant movement in Punjab. Kisan delegates from 13 districts attended the meeting. Delegates from the Riyasti Praja Mandal attended the meeting. All the groups were there: Kirtis, CSP, Gadarites, BPL Bedi, the prominent socialist leader, father of Kabir Bedi, and a Moscow-trained Gadar activist, Kartar Singh Gill. All of them were present at this, and the whole idea was that this would be a kind of joint front of all left-inclined groups and individuals. This process is not to be taken lightly, as it was 12 years earlier that the first attempt to form a provincial level organization had been made, and it had taken that long to actually bring this to fruition. And as we see the subsequent years, the way the peasant movement unfolded in the Punjab from the years 37 to 39, we will realize how important was the formation of this headquarters of the peasant movement, or the Punjab Kisan Sabha, or the Punjab Kisan Committee. Before I go on to that, I would like to just spend a short while, talking about something which is not directly a peasant movement, but it had a very powerful impact on the thinking, on the organization, and on the worldview of the peasants. This is the election campaign of 1936-7. The Government of India Act of 1935, which granted provincial autonomy, and elections were announced to all the provincial assemblies. For the first time, the ministries would be formed with elected Indian members. The Congress launched a major initiative to demonstrate that they could succeed as well at the hustings as they did on the streets and the by-lanes. And at the national level, the main campaigner turned out to be Jawaharlal Nehru, who was also the Congress President of the Year, and who had recently declared himself a believer in socialism in the scientific economic sense from the Congress platform. Jawaharlal Nehru turned this election campaign into a propaganda tour for socialism, and thus accorded to the concept a legitimacy it had never before had in popular consciousness, by lending it the weight of the prestige of the Congress president and of himself personally. As a consequence, a whole new space, political and ideological, was created for the popularization of the socialist ideal and for the functioning of those who were committed to that ideal. And these were, of course, our Kisan leaders. Nehru made 2 visits to Punjab in 1936, one from 29th May to 3rd June, and then from 28 July to 3rd August, in the course of which he covered almost the whole province. The rural part of his tour was concentrated in the central districts of Punjab. And on his first trip, apart from making a brief visit to the notorious villages, which I have talked about, Jhamman and Khalra, where he congratulated the villagers for their bravery, the most significant attempt was his 2 addresses on the same day to the Sarhali Punjab Rajnetik Political Conference. The crowds that appeared at Sarhali, a village in Amritsar district, to see and hear the Congress president broke all previous records in the province. 1 lakh people were reported to have come, some of them having walked 50 miles on foot. Baba Vasakha Singh, one of the most revered Gadri heroes, presided. Baba Son Singh Bhakna, another Gadri hero, unfurled the red flag. The best horse in the area was secured for Jawaharlal Nehru, and he was taken in procession. Socialists, Kirtis, Vyasti Praja Mandal all presented addresses to him. In his second visit at the end of July, again, the crowds reportedly reached the 1 lakh figure. Smaller conferences he addressed in Bundala, in Jalandhar, and at Khanna were also held. He also visited Firozpur and Moga, where he met many Gadar Kirti leaders and socialist workers. Jawaharlal's second visit came at the end of July, and the government obviously tried hard to make things difficult this time. On his own admission, the conference at Khanna that were addressed by Nehru was obstructed by arrests of and restrictions on activists. Harkishan Singh Surjit recalled in an interview to me that the government refused permission to hold the conference scheduled for Bundala, which was Surjit's own village, on the village common land, as was the general practice. So what did Surjit do? He ordered the standing maize crop to be cut from 4 acres of his own land to make place for the conference. And the conference was then held on the farmland of Harkishan Singh Surjit. The rest of the year was taken up with the election campaign. Peasant activists were fully immersed in the campaign on the side of the Congress. And what is significant here is the kind of election campaign that was conducted at that time. Again, Harkishan Singh Surjit, I will quote, he was managing the election campaign of Master Kabul Singh, who was a communist standing on a Congress ticket. And he describes how they spent only rupees 2,000, and that too all was collected from people in amounts of 2 annas and 4 annas. He also says in Son Singh Josh's election, which he was contesting against one of the biggest landlords of the province, they even saved 3,000 rupees from what the people gave. Whole campaign was conducted on bicycles. Similarly, Karam Singh Maan tells us that in Josh's election, they saved money because the people, when they came to vote, would leave 1 anna or 1 rupee along with the vote. So do understand where the tradition of contributions for the langar, for the Kisan Mall, for the blankets and all is coming from. As the governor, H.W. Emerson, acutely observed at the time in a letter to the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, he said, I doubt whether any village in the province has not been included in the election campaign by one party or another. And most villages have had a constant succession of visits from canvassers. There has certainly been a great stirring of the political consciousness of the masses. Do note, this has been specially marked in Sikh constituencies. And I was told the other day that with many of the smaller voters, there was a definite prejudice against anyone who could be described as pro-government, unquote. This stirring of the political consciousness, which the Viceroy points out, without which no long-term movement for change can sustain itself, was an achievement that would prove invaluable in creating new possibilities for political action in the future. The election campaign had crystallized the issues in terms of pro-British and anti-British. All these ideas had been taken into corners where they had never been heard before, not even during the phases of mass anti-British struggle. The logic of the electoral process, that all areas are included in its ambit, pushed political parties to go into areas they would never dare or care to go to in normal times. For a struggle, you tend to mobilize only those whom you can count on, whom you have worked on earlier, since at that point it is their strength that you need. In elections, you cannot win without winning over even those who you may not know at all. Hence, the drive to extend yourself becomes inevitable. Therefore, the impact of this election campaign of Nehru's tours is something much more than one would just imagine or think about if one was talking in incremental terms. In fact, the momentum that was generated by this election campaign was not only maintained but increased after it was over. And the year 1937, therefore, may be said to mark the real beginning of the most vigorous phase of the peasant movement in pre-independence Punjab. In fact, in that year, one can begin to get the feel of the intensity of the political activity that then characterized the years till the outbreak of the Second World War. Even though there were no big morchas or big struggles in this year, as they were later in 38 and 39, the movement had in fact reached a very high level, with consistent village-level campaigns culminating in a series of big conferences in September and October. And further, there was ample evidence that the unity of different political strands, Congress, Socialist, Communist, and also some Akali groups was actually working on the ground. I will now go over to the next phase of the movement, which is 1938 to 39. And as my time is getting shorter and shorter, I will only be able to give you one or two examples and make some generalizations before I go on to the period after 39. In the years 38 and 39, the peasant movement in Punjab reached its most mature phase of the pre-independence years. It blossomed forth in many directions. New areas, new issues, new demands were introduced, and the older bases were fortified further. Any number of specific struggles, or morchas as they were popularly called, developed in these years. The first one that I will talk about, again very briefly, was the one, because it was different from all the others, was the movement of the tenants of the canal colonies of Nilibar, Montgomery, and Multan. The problems faced by tenants, they were actually more properly sharecroppers, were that they had no occupancy rights, no security of tenure, no legal curbs on rent enhancement. But the tenants we are about to meet in this struggle were not even strictly speaking tenants, but subtenants of, hold your breath, leaseholding companies who leased large chunks of colony land from the government. So mind you, private companies going into agriculture is also nothing new. And let us see what happens at that time. How this system operated and how it came into being is best described in the words of the then Punjab governor. Large areas of land he said, on the Sutlej Valley project are leased by government on temporary leases for 3, 4 or 5 years, pending their allotment to permanent settlers. These temporary leases are allotted on a system of calling for tenders, and in some cases are taken up by capitalists who secure very large areas. The lessees put in their own subtenants and naturally are anxious to make as much profit as they can. There is no doubt that in many cases, they more or less rack rent the subtenants who usually pay in kind, sharecropping. The commonest form of rent is half the produce, calculated after considerable deductions in favor of the landlord have been made from the common heap, and the subtenant has to pay all the canal dues, which, by the way, were very high. In these days of low prices, this is a very severe rent, and it is a fact that the subtenants have a substantial grievance in this respect. There was also evidence of the agents of companies behaving just like the other big landlords and exacting bigar or free labor, goods and services from the villagers. Particularly obnoxious to the tenants was the practice of having to carry the company's share to the godowns free of charge. It reminds me of the Tabhaga movement, where the peasants did not want to take it to the khalihan of the jotedar, and at times being forced to store their own produce in company godowns. Produce was divided into 2 equal shares only after, as the governor described, considerable deductions in favor of the landlord had been made from the common heap. These considerable deductions, if we put them all together, actually meant that the peasant got only about 30% of the gross produce instead of the 50% that might appear at first glance. In addition, the tenant paid the entire water rate. Though the movement began in the area of the leasing companies for specific reasons, it did spread later, especially in the post-war years, to the proper landlord areas of the districts of Montgomery and Multan. The initial stimulus for protest was provided in 1937 by rivalry between leasing companies, which the Kisan leaders were able to use to the advantage of the tenants. The Punjab Kisan Committee leadership sent their best leaders and cadre to help organize the tenants, and significant victories were won. In 1938, there was again trouble, and there were reports that 40,000 tenants, according to one estimate, went on strike, and a deputation came to meet the revenue minister. Obviously, that was a very large number. The government reacted. It announced fixation of maximum rents to be taken from tenants. It cancelled the tenders that had been received, and it announced that leasing companies in Nilibar could no longer claim any rent higher than 50%. A very, very big victory for the tenants, because now the struggle became one for implementation and extension of this concession to other areas. I will not go into the details of this, but just to say that this victory was won at a very high cost. While the government did give those concessions, at the same time, it took very harsh measures against the activists. All the prominent activists were arrested, interned, externed, and the tenants also were given very harsh sentences, at times of 2.5 years of rigorous imprisonment. And it also shows us that for a cadre to emerge from within such a rack-rented and backward group was no easy process. And therefore, the crucial role that was played by the activists and cadre that was sent from the central districts by the Kisan Committee was very, very important in building up the movement over here. I will now come to the non-tenant struggles in this period, 38 and 39. I am completely running out of time, even though I started very late. So I think I probably still have a little time. The district, I now come to the district of Amritsar, in which a very, very famous Kisan struggle was fought in 1938. And I'll just begin with a little background of Amritsar, because again, when we're talking about traditions of struggle, Amritsar is very important, and the example of Amritsar is very important to actually explain the whole idea of what it means to have a tradition of struggle. The district of Amritsar occupied an enviable position in the annals of the struggle for freedom in Punjab. Jallianwala Bagh had already immortalized it in 1919. The Akali movement too fought many of its biggest battles within its borders. both in Amritsar city and in the Dehat. Both city and countryside had participated fully in the civil disobedience movement of 1930-32. Kisan activists had made the area a major base, with Kirti, CPI group, socialists all represented in good measure. It was also the home district of the Gadri Babas, Son Singh Bhakna and Jwala Singh, of Son Singh Josh, Dr. Kichlu, Dr. Satyapal, Udham Singh Nagoke, Munshi Ahmad Deen, Pratap Singh Kairo. Thus, the Congress, the Akalis, the Communists, the Socialists all had a significant political presence here. As a consequence, it was a highly politicized area. Little wonder then that the movement that I'm about to describe was a joint effort by all the different political groups and was able to arouse an unprecedented, for a Kisan movement, degree of popular support from non-peasant sections of the population. The morcha I'm talking about is called the Amritsar Kisan Morcha, or the Amritsar Bandobast Morcha, or the Uchche Pulda Morcha, or Bhandari Pulda Morcha, as it was variously described. This was launched on 20th July 1938. On 20th July 1938, the Amritsar Bandobast Committee, Bandobast means settlement, revenue settlement. This was a committee formed to protest against the proposed resettlement, revenue settlement of Amritsar district, which they anticipated was going to be very high. So this was a committee formed for that. They had called for a demonstration, and it was meant to be an expression of a multitude of peasant grievances, including the issue of resettlement. So this demonstration that was to be called in Amritsar on 20th July in the civil lines, outside the office of the Canal and Settlement Offices and outside the houses of the Revenue Minister and Deputy Commissioner. It had been supported by the District Kisan Committee, the District Congress Committee, and thousands of peasants began to pour into Amritsar on this date. By afternoon, a huge meeting was in progress in the Jallianwala Bagh, which all anti-imperialist forces had helped to make into a living memorial by making it the venue of an unending stream of political gatherings. However, the government imposed Section 144 in the area of the city north of the Lahore-Delhi railway line in which the civil lines lay. The demonstration was thus made impossible. At the meeting, therefore, a call was given for volunteers to defy the ban, and about 300 men representing the Bandobast Committee and Kisan Committee and drawn from different villages were formed into a Jatha. This Jatha, led by Udham Singh Nagoke, the nationalist Akali leader, and accompanied by other leaders such as Harnam Singh, Kasel, Sohan Singh Josh, Bibi Ragbir Kaur, a very important peasant leader, as well as a crowd of at least 5,000 to 6,000 peasants and several thousand sympathizers, marched through the Hall Bazaar, which is the main market of Amritsar, and then carrying flags with the hammer and sickle, Congress flags, revolutionary placards, began to cross this bridge to try and go into the civil lines area. When it reached this railway overbridge, half the Jatha was allowed to cross over before the magistrate's declaration was read out. And naturally, they said that they were going to present their grievances and they should be allowed to move forward. Then the city magistrate ordered a lathi charge, and about 100 police constables fell upon the crowd with their lathis. The processionists immediately sat down on the ground and then lay on each other, exposing their backs to the lathis of the police. The police then proceeded to drag and push them to get them out of the way. The lathi charge, which was generally described as very severe, and the use of mounted police to push back the crowd led to several older members of the Jatha falling unconscious, and Udham Singh Nagoke himself badly injured in the eye and lay bleeding. In all, 300 people were seriously injured. Rest were taken away in police vans and lorries, or left to be cared for by the Seva Samiti volunteers. The next day, the Congress MLAs created such a furor in the Punjab legislative accounts of the lathi charge, and even produced broken iron-shod pieces of lathis in the assembly. The people of Amritsar responded as if the challenge had been thrown to them. The spot at which the lathi charge took place was the very same at which the crowd that was going to demand The release of Dr. Satyabal and Dr. Kichlu in April 1919 was fired upon. Look at the importance of tradition. The incident which had triggered off the chains leading to Jallianwala Bagh massacre. In fact, something of the spirit of 1919 and of the Akali Jathas of the Akali movement seemed to have come alive in Amritsar of those days. Same evening as the Lathi Charge, a huge public meeting was held in Jallianwala Bagh. Next day, 2 public meetings were held in the same Jallianwala Bagh. Saifuddin Kichlu again addressed another meeting. The entire bazaar went on hartal, including Katra Aluwalia, comprising the cloth markets, Guru Bazaar, Namak Mandi, grain and bullion markets, Satta chambers. And in the evening, a huge crowd of thousands assembled to support the Jatha sent by the War Council, which then suffered a number of lathi charges. Congress members of the city municipal committee then walked out when they were not allowed to move an adjournment motion. Workers' organizations again offered to contribute a jatha to the Satyagraha. I could go on and on. Support came from all over the country. Swami Sejanand, N.G. Ranga, Pratap Singh Kero was a member of the committee which then was formed to deal with the whole situation. And this went on. The jathas kept on coming from all over the province. Jathas of peasants came, and for 20 days this went on till on the 9th and 10th of August, a visit by Chotu Ram, who was Revenue Minister, and the Prime Minister of Punjab, Sikandar Hayat Khan, to Amritsar was used by the administration to enter into negotiations with the leadership and come to some kind of an understanding where Section 144 was then removed from that area. I do not have time to go into more details or even to talk about some of the very important lessons of this movement, except to point out that what is very evident from the success of this movement is that it was because of the unity of all the political parties. Akalis, Congress, Socialists, Kirtis, CPI, everybody was in this together. The merchants came out in support because Congress was in the party. Others came out in support because Akalis were over there. So the success of a movement, whether it is a movement even of the peasants, heavily depends upon what kind of support you can garner from other sections of society, from broader political forces, from political parties, which is why today the government is so keen to say political parties should not be seen in this, as if there is something wrong about movements being connected to political parties or political parties coming to play a role. And somehow even the peasants movement themselves are wary of this because they fear that this will be used against them. But in the entire history of peasant struggles, political parties have been in the thick and thin of those struggles. This is also a legitimate field of politics. This is also politics. It is not beyond politics. Yes, I think what I will have to do now is to actually just not go into any details about the rest of what I wanted to say, but I will just mention in one line each what the rest of the period, the kind of things that we saw. First of all, I would like to mention that the other big morcha, which I'm really sorry that I couldn't talk about, was what I have called the long morcha. Not the long march, but the long morcha, the Lahore Kisan Morcha of 1938 to 39, which carried on for something like 9 months, from March of 1939 to December of 1939. And in this, 5,000 people went to jail. The Jathas, volunteers of peasants came from all over the province. The issue was the resettlement of the district, where a higher land revenue was being expected. The morcha did not result in success in the sense of that they won the demand. In fact, it fizzled out in the end because the government refused to negotiate with them. And one of the issues that I've talked about in my work, which I don't have the time to talk about now, but I will just mention, is that how one seeing this, the history of both the Amritsar Kisan Morcha and the Lahore Kisan Morcha, one realizes that it is also very important for the leadership to see at which point in the movement a settlement which at least gets some of the major issues settled or has resulted in a major advance in the political consciousness of the peasants, the time has come to settle and not let a movement's weaknesses be exposed and end up then just fizzling out. This is the contrast that I see between the Amritsar Kisan Morcha and the Lahore Kisan Morcha, where in Amritsar they were able to come to a settlement quickly before the movement had spent itself out, at the peak of the movement, whereas in Lahore they were not able to do that, and therefore the movement fizzled out. This does not mean that the Lahore Kisan Morcha did not have a very powerful impact. It galvanized the peasants of the whole province. People who participated in it, people who heard about it, people who talked about it, were obviously all deeply influenced by what happened. So that is not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is something different. Also, in the Lahore Kisan Morcha, it was the Punjab Kisan Committee by itself. It did not, and it had not sought, and it did not have the support of the Congress, the Akalis, and even other wings of the left groups and parties. It was very much a solo show by the Punjab Kisan Committee, and therefore, obviously, it had limitations of how far it could go. The other major movement, which of course I do not have time to talk about, but which I've dealt with at great length, was the Muzahara movement in Patiala state. Year 1939 also saw the peaking of this movement. This was a very powerful movement which started in the early 30s and finally culminated in agrarian legislation which gave property rights to the tenants in 1953. So it was a very long drawn-out movement. But from about the mid-30s, the Punjab Kisan Committee, especially the left wing, they come into it and they give the movement a lot of momentum and then guide it through all the way till 1953. And a lot of sacrifices are made in this movement, lots of very important gains are made in this movement, and its significance in the history of the Punjab Kisan movement cannot be underestimated. But I do not have the time to go into it now. And therefore, what I will move on and say that further radicalization and strengthening of the movement took place from the years 1939 to 41, and then from 42 onwards in the Quit India movement. From 39 to 41, there was the anti-war movement, in which again the left-wing groups and parties were very prominent, and peasants were involved in a very big way, and many sacrifices were made in this. So the issues on which peasants are mobilized are not just economic issues. We must remember this. The issues on which they get mobilized are also larger national issues. Here, anti-fascist, anti-war. A lot of propaganda on these lines had been done in the Punjab right from 1937. So there was a very powerful anti-war movement in this period. The individual civil disobedience movement was also very powerful. And about, if I'm not wrong, about 4,000 people went to jail in this. And in fact, the communists succeeded in making this individual civil disobedience movement into a mass civil disobedience movement. But again, that's a long story. I won't have the time to go into it. 1942 itself was very interesting. Though Quit India movement did not have the same kind of response in Punjab as it had in other areas, and this for two very important reasons. Two of the political groups which were most powerful, along with the Congress among the peasantry, that is the Akalis and the communists, were both for the war. They were not against, they were supporting the British in the war and not supporting the Quit India movement. So obviously, without leadership, it could not be expected that there would be a very powerful response. But this does not mean there even then that there was no response or that the mood of the people was completely with the Quit India movement. In fact, communist leader after communist leader told us that during this period, how difficult it was for them to even go to the peasants and talk about the party line of People's War. He said, people said, you have been telling us all these years to fight the British, and now you are coming and telling us to support the British. What has happened to you? So he said, in fact, we were told by our party leadership also to lie low for this time. We couldn't make much headway, and the sentiment was so strong in favor of Quit India, even though the number of incidents and the kind of response that was there in other provinces was not there because of the lack of leadership. The Congress, in fact, it's very interesting what Surjit said to me in his interview. He said, we, meaning the left, we were the Congress in the villages. So if those who were the Congress in the villages were not there in the Quit India movement, how could you expect the Quit India movement to have that kind of resonance in the villages? And I will end with the INA prisoners release movement. Again, this is very, very interesting because this is again a province which is supposed to be from where recruitment takes place, martial races, but the support for the soldiers of the INA who were being released and the support for the movement for the release of the Indian National Army soldiers, the kind of support it got in Punjab and Haryana was fantastic. In fact, reports say that such crowds had never been seen in the province before. When INA heroes were returning home, they were welcomed by crowds whose size and enthusiasm, I quote, was unparalleled. At the Lahore railway station itself, Shahnawaz, Dhillon and Sehgal were welcomed by more than 1 lakh of people, and they say Lahore had never seen these kinds of this kind of crowds before. So what I'm concluding from this is that in a province which was supposed to be known for its huge presence in the British Army and therefore for its loyalty, it is indeed striking that there was such overwhelming support for those who in army parlance would be classified as traitors. This testifies to the depth of nationalist sentiment and of secular sentiment and anti-British sentiment and political consciousness among the peasants of the Punjab, because soldiers belong to also that soldiers belong to all religions, and never did that become an issue in this movement. So therefore, it would perhaps now be possible for us to conclude that, this is my conclusion, by the mid-40s, large sections of the peasants of Punjab had shown that they were politically conscious and willing to struggle for and sacrifice for the causes that were dear to them. Many had sacrificed their lives. Large numbers had gone to jail. Even larger numbers had voted with their feet by trudging miles to attend conferences. They had mourned the martyrs, stunned into death-like silence by the hangings of Bhagat Singh, Rajguru and Sukhdev. They had refused to pay taxes or contribute to the war effort. They had become shy of joining the army. They rejected well-loved leaders when they made the mistake of supporting the war effort, and came out in lakhs to welcome the INA prisoners whom the British treated as traitors. They had voted for nationalist candidates and even left money along with their votes to show their support. They had contributed grain and cooked for thousands in the langars organized at big conferences. They had hidden runaway activists in their home and carried food for them to fields when they were hiding. In these and many other ways, ordinary men and women of the Punjab, of the rural Punjab, had shown where their hearts lay. It is for the historian to carefully collect and then tell the present generation the stories that they have left behind. It is evident then that the legacy of peasant protest that the Kisans of Punjab can draw on is a rich treasure in which are embedded not only sagas of heroism, much wisdom based on varied experience. For example, the history we have traversed shows us how religion can inspire with its stories of love and sacrifice and not be allowed to divide with its history of strife and violence. How Gurdwaras provided sanctuaries and succor to those fighting for the deprived and not havens to the fanatics. How wise governments gave in to demands as in 1907, seeing the direction of the wind, and how those that did not, standing on prestige and using harsh methods, ultimately had to go. That firm, patient, prolonged, non-violent struggle based on an understanding of the issues and clear in ideology has a strength and resilience that is difficult to withstand. That when people are willing to sacrifice their all, it is for a larger purpose than to secure their immediate interests. It is for their country, or the future of their children, or their faith, or their way of life, which they see as under threat. Remember, if their grandparents and parents could, walking on foot, braving heat and cold, lying in prison for months and years on end, braving lathis and bullets, take on the mighty British government, can they not, with far more resources, insist at least on a hearing and on justice from their own elected government? I'm talking, of course, about the peasants who are knocking at our doors. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee, for telling us the story of how plowshares were beaten into swords instead of the other way, which we have read, and also telling us how the experience in the past should be a very, very important pointer for our politicians for understanding the present. Thank you very much. Professor Mahalakshmi, please take over.
Thank you so much. Professor Ameyo Bagchi is with us, and I will request him to say a few words just now. Unfortunately, because of some miscommunication, some issues, we were not able to get him in at 11 o'clock, but he would like to say something at this point. Professor Bagchi.
He's on mute.
He's on mute. He needs to be unmuted.
Professor Bagchi, can you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes, we can.
I've just unmuted myself. Okay. I'm very sorry that I couldn't attend the first meeting and could not welcome the incoming president, Professor Kesavan Veluthat. I did not have the good fortune of knowing him earlier, but I knew him as one of the leading students of South Indian medieval and pre-modern history. And I also knew that he had followed in the footsteps of Professor Irfan Habib in carrying out a big project on creating a historical atlas of South India. And it's very appropriate that he should take over as the president of the Indian History Congress from now on for 2020-21. I have the good fortune of knowing Mridula for a very long time, so I would not refer to her as Professor Mukherjee. There are several characteristics of Professor Mukherjee or Mridula I had mentioned, that as you can imagine just listening to her lecture, that she's passionate about what she's doing. It is not just for her a matter of dry historical facts. It's a matter of imbuing all those facts with the, let us say, passion and the ideology of somebody who wants to see the future of India in the hands of ordinary people and taking it away from the landlords, the big corporate houses, and powerful politicians who have only their own pelf to or power to cultivate. Mridula has not only worked on peasant movements in Punjab, on which she is a recognized authority, but she has also worked along with Bipan Chandra and her husband Aditya on the independence movement of India. And there, what they have achieved is to show that in the political movement and the economic and political were always interconnected in all these movements. It was not a question of simply getting statehood, but it's also a question of getting the levers of power, economic power in the hands of ordinary people. What happened after that independence struggle is a matter of the history of the last 60 or 70 years. And they have also written on the India since independence, and there may be controversies about what they have written, but there is no question that all through this there is a transparent their commitment to again seeing a future of India which is much better than we had seen so far and what our ancestors have also seen. And I hope that the vision that Mridula, Aditya and others have and Professor Habib have of India will ultimately be realized despite the machinations of all kinds of external and internal forces trying to suppress the desires of the ordinary people, the desires which are entirely based on their own work, on their own volition and all that. With these few words, I will end, and thanking both Professor Belthat and Mridula for their wonderful work that will serve historians and students of Indian politics and economics for a long time. I'll end my talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Bagchi.
Thank
It
you
is my
very much.
pleasant duty to thank Professor Mridula Mukherjee for delivering an excellent lecture on the Punjab Kisan movement in colonial Punjab. The significance of such a historical analysis cannot be lost to this audience. At a time when the Punjab Kisans have been standing at the borders of Delhi for over a month, raising issues of livelihood, corporatization, and revocation of the 3 farm laws that were passed by the Parliament in September 2020, such a reflection by a historian who has extensively researched on the theme of non-violent farmers' protests less than a century earlier is of utmost importance. I also thank Professor Keshavan Veluthat for graciously chairing this session. As he very rightly pointed out, this session is normally held on the evening of the first day when the annual session is held. And unfortunately, this year, we could not have the annual session on this date. This evening would have been the time when we would have otherwise scheduled this particular lecture. It was really to mark that lecture as it would have occurred if the 81st session had been held, when Professor Veluthat would have taken over as the president, that we made the request to him, and he was so kind as to agree to chair this session. I take this opportunity to place on record my deep gratitude to Professor Amiyo Bagchi for his unstinting support and sage advice throughout this past year. I'm really very grateful to you, sir. Last but not the least, I thank the IHC team that has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that this program could be held without a hitch. Ansh, Deepak, Deepna, Sneha, Prerna, Aishwarya, Trisha, Novonil, Abhimanyu, and Jitender. Incidentally, all of them are sitting in their homes in different parts of the country, and they have been coordinating with each other from their homes. So from Jammu to Kerala, from Assam to Maharashtra, we have had people who have been working for the IHC, and that is typical of the IHC itself, its national character. I'm grateful to all our members and also the non-members who have registered for our events and participated in this morning's program. I was just told that over 500 people have attended this program. I request all of you to join us for our afternoon program at 2:30 p.m. when we will have the inaugural session of the webinar on Indian civilization historical perspectives. With these words, I thank you once again for being here, and I look forward to meeting all